Okay, so 52 years ago, just a few weeks before the very first Earth Day, David started his butterfly conservation career. He wrote to his local newspaper imploring the town council to stop cutting down stinging nettles, as they're the food for caterpillars of the peacock and tortoiseshell butterflies. This led to an interview and a feature article in the newspaper where 15-year-old David talked of the need to conserve British butterflies. A university degree in zoology followed, as well as a career as an agricultural entomologist with the New South Wales Department of Agriculture and also Washington State University. But David never forgot his butterfly roots. He researched Australian monarch biology for his PhD and published many studies on butterfly biology and conservation in both Australia and the Pacific Northwest. As one of the Daves in Dave Squared, as in David James and David Nunnally, he co-authored the magisterial, according to David Attenborough, Life Histories of Cascadia Butterflies, and then wrote the Book of Butterflies. He is currently working on the Lives of Butterflies to be published in 2023. The title of David's presentation is The Reports of the Death of the Monarch Are Greatly Exaggerated. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, David.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to the next episode of the Western Monarch saga. So I will focus primarily on the Western Monarch, but we can't avoid talking about the Eastern Monarch to some extent as well. So without further ado, yeah, I mean, I think the title pretty much sums up what you will hear, a rather more optimistic view of the future of the monarch than maybe perhaps you've heard in more recent times. And I'm a bit on my own in that regard, but so far so good. So what I'm going to do is split the talk into three parts, as shown there. First of all, I'll talk about the historical perspective of population dynamics, primarily in the West, but also touching the Eastern population as well, and likely drivers for the decline that has occurred during that time. And then I'll talk about the environmental and physiological drivers behind population dynamics. And then finally, I'll talk about a couple of the controversies that relate to monarch butterflies in this day and age, and also the future and conservation. So every talk about the monarch that I give is different, which is good if you keep coming to my lectures, because it's ever changing. The butterfly and what it's doing and our understanding of it is always changing. So I think I last presented to Wobber on this just over a year ago, perhaps, and it's very much different today than what it was then. But first of all, historical perspectives on population dynamics from 1997 to last year, or this year, of course, and the likely drivers behind the decline that's occurred. So we're all familiar with the decline of the Eastern population. This picture taken by Lincoln Brower shows the Mexican colonies in 97 from the air, obviously, and you can see, just a billion butterflies probably there at that time. That was the estimate for the Eastern North American population back in the late 90s. And then you fast forward 20 years, same area, another aerial view of the overwintering population, and you can just see rusting on the trees, which is actually the butterflies sitting on the trees. And at that time, the estimates were it was about 95 million there. Still sounds like a lot of butterflies, but not a billion. And that represents a 95% decline. And they estimate the population by the area that the butterflies occupy. As you can see from here, you can see the trees are covered in butterflies, and so they just count the trees and estimate the area that they occupy. There's no way that they can count individual butterflies like we can in the West in our overwintering population. So the monarch in North America is an icon, and it's under threat and has been for some time, for the last 20 years. And this led to the petition for listing of the monarch under the Endangered Species Act which was done in August 2014 by Lincoln Brower and the Xerces Society. And then a decision was made December 2020, where they concluded that listing was warranted, but precluded by higher priority candidates. And I think they're going to revisit the issue again in another 2 years. But, you know, regardless of whether it becomes listed as an endangered species or not, the petition for listing has done a terrific job in raising the awareness amongst the general public of the plight of the monarch butterfly and its decline. And so much has been done since 2014 in terms of awareness and actually doing things for the monarch, like habitat restoration and planting milkweed. And, you know, it's just incredible how much has happened during that time. So even if it's not listed, and you know, some of us don't think it should be listed anyway, because of the regulations and things that go with that. But regardless, it's done a good job in terms of increasing the public awareness of monarchs, which was needed because people just weren't aware that this favorite butterfly of the world was disappearing slowly but surely. So this is the graph that most of you have probably seen, updated every year. This is for the eastern population. And so the numbers there represent hectares at the overwintering site. So 96, 97 was the highest number, you know, nearly well, above 18 hectares. So times that by 2.25 and you get the acreage. So very significant acreage, just solid water or tree to tree butterflies at that time. And since then, as you can see, there's been a decline. There's been ups and downs, of course. And the lowest was 0.67 of a hectare, which is, you know, just barely an acre, which is when Lincoln Brower decided to petition for the endangered species listing. And since that time, you know, I'd like to think that the increased awareness that I just spoke about resulted in some of this you know, increase since that time. It's gone down a few years too, but, you know, there's been some good years, 15, 16, 18, 19. We haven't got this year's data yet for this past winter, but there are suggestions and anecdotal reports that it will be bigger than last year and possibly as big as it was in 18, 19. So you know, there has been a decline, but it's still, you know, alive and kicking to some extent, particularly in more recent years. So the big question, of course, is why? Why has this decline occurred over the past 20 years? We still don't know the definitive answer why. I think the definitive answer why is a multifactorial thing. There's more than one reason why they've declined. We don't know the relative importance of the possible reasons either. All we can do is speculate, really. There's research being done on some of these reasons that I'll talk about now. But, you know, and some of the research is conflicting. So there's three major reasons probably, or possible factors behind the decline. Loss of summer breeding habitat is probably the number one, the one that was first championed anyway by a lot of people. And then more recently, it's been suggested that there's been increased mortality during the autumn migration. And then thirdly, the increased use of neonicotinoid insecticides during the same time frame. And I'll show you some graphs to demonstrate that in a minute. So those are the three major things, and there's probably others as well. Motor vehicles, the rising number of motor vehicles during the fall migration has been another possibility. So all these things could combine together, and we really don't know a single, there will be no single reason. It'll be a combination of factors. I didn't mention climate change, which is probably more pertinent for the West. So I'll talk more about that during this lecture for the Western population. But that could be having an impact on the Eastern population as well. So this figure shows the adoption of genetically engineered crops in the US in the same time frame that the decline of the monarch has occurred. So you can see now, practically all crops that the large acre crops in the Midwest use herbicide tolerant stock. So, they can plant these crops and they can spray Roundup. They're Roundup ready. They can spray Roundup from the air and kill every weed over miles of cropland, basically. Prior to genetically engineered crops, that were resistant to herbicides, this wasn't possible. It had to be done, on a much smaller scale by tractors, and so you could never actually get rid of every weed in the crop. And these crops, a lot of them, corn in particular, was a good habitat for milkweed and monarch butterflies. There were some studies showing that the breeding success of monarchs on milkweed within corn was better than outside of corn. So this is a huge area of the Midwest agricultural region that is now not devoid of milkweed, because it still occurs along roadsides probably, but it's a huge area that it doesn't occur in now, whereas it did before. And so that's one example of habitat loss, but there's others, of course. I mean, urban expansion, other agricultural development, they've all contributed to there being less milkweed on the landscape in the eastern US than there was 20 years ago. And there's some data to show that this is indeed true. So that, that's probably the most favored hypothesis for the eastern population decline. Neonicotinoid insecticides, this is one of my favored theories for the decline, since I've worked with neonicotinoid insecticides since 1995 in my agricultural work, so I'm well aware of them and what they can do. And the sublethal impacts of these insecticides on pollinators generally, and probably monarchs included amongst that, is not to be underestimated. There's a lot of scientific evidence now showing that they are a reason for pollinator decline, such that these insecticides are now not available for outdoor use in Europe. They've been banned since 2019. So obviously the governments there took notice of the scientific research and decided that it was not in the best interest to continue using them. So farmers have had to find alternatives. So there's a huge cloud of suspicion surrounding neonicotinoids. And if you look at the adoption of these chemicals over the same time frame again, 95 to 2010 and further on, it's almost 100% now, just like the adoption of herbicide-resistant crops. It's actually hard to find household or home garden insecticides that do not contain neonicotinoids. You have to check the labels, and it's very hard to find them, those products, I think on next slide, things like these that don't contain neonicotinoids. And of course, they don't say neonicotinoid, they say imidacloprid or clethianidin or the other chemicals that are neonicotinoids. So you have to be aware of the actual chemical involved. But take it from me, it's hard to avoid them now. So they're being used all over the landscape, not just in agriculture, but in home gardens and cities and urban areas as well. And I'm particularly concerned about their toxicity via nectar, because I could give a whole lecture on neonicotinoids, which I promise I won't, but they are very persistent, a bit like DDT in the past. They're not harmful to people, which is why they're favored. They're not very toxic to human beings or vertebrates generally, but they're very soluble in water. They move around the landscape, and they're long-lived. They live for at least 2 or 3 years. Well, they're effective for 2 or 3 years. If you apply neonicotinoids for aphids in your garden one summer, you really don't need to do it the next summer, because it's still there in the ground, sucked up by the plant. That's the other thing. They're systemic. So they're sucked up by the plant, and they can be in the nectar too, in low amounts. But that's the whole feature of the sublethal studies on pollinators the fact that very small amounts of these chemicals can interfere with behavior and biological aspects of the life of pollinators, not necessarily directly killing them, but just affecting them in some way that makes them less productive, which over generations can lead to population decline. So this figure here shows the average levels of neonicotinoids found in, these figures are taken from publications. So you're seeing crops 50 to 100 parts per billion. So these are tiny amounts, parts per billion, but they're still biologically significant in terms of having sublethal effects. In home gardens, it's much higher because the rates that are used are higher and people use more. Higher rates still if you're targeting trees and bushes because they're bigger and you have to apply more, up to 5,000 parts per billion. And glasshouse crops in Europe were the worst offenders for this, in having up to 21,000 parts per billion. So you can see that nectar can hold and can contain these neonicotinoids. I did a quick lab experiment on monarchs in 2018. I think I've mentioned this before, where I used 23.5 parts per billion, so a tiny amount, but I used that amount because it was an amount that was found in wildflowers nectar surrounding crop fields in the UK. So a field realistic level, butterflies feeding on those wildflowers would have fed upon that amount of neonicotinoids. So I fed my monarchs on this amount, one group with neonicotinoid, the other was control group. And the neonicotinoid group, unfortunately for them, didn't have a choice. So that's all they fed on. And the outcome was that there was, after 3 weeks, 80% of them had died, which if you're a monarch and you need to live longer than that, even in the summer, you live at least 4 or 5 weeks. And of course, the autumn population needs to live for 6 months. So this small study suggested that sublethal amounts of one neonicotinoid, imidacloprid, one of them, had an effect on the longevity of butterflies, of the monarch butterflies. So, and I did some follow-up work looking at the impact of the same rate of imidacloprid on the viability of eggs laid by females that are feeding on neonicotinoid. And I found it's a very, very short study, not enough data to publish, but what I found was that there was much higher mortality amongst the eggs in the treated females than the untreated females. I think it was like 30 or 40% of eggs died. And in recent years, we've found a lot of eggs in the wild that look fine, but they don't hatch. So increased sterility or mortality of eggs seems to be a feature in recent years of monarchs in the West. So this might be one factor behind it, but not enough data to publish yet. Anyway, so moving on to the Western population, where we've had the same decline as in the East, but our populations have always been much smaller. At its peak, we probably had, a couple of million, but we've had the decline during the same time frame, and this is the corresponding graph. And it's slightly different in that the decline happened very much at the turn of the century, and thereafter it hasn't really changed that much. It's bounced around a bit, but the big decline happened quite suddenly, more suddenly than in the East. And since that time, there's been bad years and there's been good years. And so overall, it's been, the overwintering populations have been around 200,000 butterflies. And we count the populations in California through the Thanksgiving counts by citizen scientists. And we've been doing that thanks to Mia Monroe and the Xerces Society since 1997. So that's why we've got this good data set. So yeah, it's declined from what it was late last century. And going back further than 97, we don't have good data, but we do have some data, and it suggests that it was up at that level during that time. So it definitely seemed to be a drop around turn of the century. But even as recent as 2017, we were still finding 200,000 butterflies at the overwintering sites. And there's 200 to 300, I think now, overwintering sites stretching from San Diego to north of San Francisco. This is the most famous one, Pismo State Beach Park. If you haven't been there, I recommend going. There's just a few trees there, and they get covered in monarchs in good years, like 2014 was, up to 30,000 butterflies at the one site. By Mexican standards, it's nothing, but it's still very impressive to look at. And in that year, there was 235,000 in all the colonies. So what are the potential drivers for the Western monarch decline during the same period? I mean, some of the same things crop up, obviously. Lack of milkweed, pardon me. But particularly in California, we in Washington and Pacific Northwest generally, Idaho, and parts of Oregon are pretty fortunate in having pretty good milkweed populations, more so than California. California is where the milkweed problem lies, particularly early spring milkweed, and also a general lack of milkweed. The roads department in California did a good job for a lot of years in getting rid of milkweed off of roadsides. Agriculture has taken a toll on milkweed populations there. It's changing now with the efforts that I mentioned since 2014. There's been a lot of restoration of milkweed, so we're probably better now than we were a few years ago, but there's still a lot of improvement probably. Poor survival overwintering sites is probably another issue, particularly as I'll talk about in a minute, storms, winter storms, and the frequency of those seems to be growing, which may be part of climate warming. Pesticide use, the same as in the East. We have the same issues, California in particular, but also Washington and all the states really have their agricultural areas where neonicotinoids are the prime insecticide used. Climate change, I've mentioned that already, and milkweed reductions in the Greater West. I mentioned we're pretty well off in Washington state, but some other states are not so good perhaps. So we need more milkweed in other parts of the West as well. So these are probably the main possible factors for the decline. And then around about 2015, 2016, there was much talk of extinction and extinction risk. There were some publications published, including one by Cheryl Schultz in 2017 that used modeling to show that 30,000 butterflies might be the extinction threshold for Western monarchs, meaning that once the population goes below that level, it might be hard for the butterflies to regain the population again. But this was determined by modeling, and models are only as good as the information you put in them, the data. And even though we know a lot about monarch butterflies, we certainly don't know everything. And it's quite surprising how little we do know, actually. Even though it's probably the world's most studied butterfly, there's still a lot we don't know. So, I personally took that with a grain of salt. But, with all this talk, wouldn't you believe it, the next year it came true. We had population of actually less than 30,000, just like the extinction risk was suggested to be. And that happened just in 1 year. 164,000 monarchs went missing in 1 year, an 85% decline in 1 year, and no overwintering site with more than 3,000 monarchs. And the same thing happened in the following year, 2019 to 2020, about 30,000 butterflies. So all of a sudden, we were down to the so-called extinction risk level. So there's the graph updated to show that from 200,000 in 2017, it went down to 30. So you can see, we had not experienced that level. I think that one was 58,000 in 2009. So we'd never been down to 30,000 before. But then it got even worse. In 2020, it went down to 1,899, counted at the 200 overwintering sites throughout California. So obviously some people then were thinking, well, the extinction threshold's been breached and now they're disappearing. So only 199 monarchs that year at Pismo Beach, where in 2014, where the previous picture was from, there was 30,000. So you can see, 30,000, 28, 20, 12, 3, 7, 199. I actually went there that year, and it was quite, I think this picture is actually of those 199 butterflies. So it was pretty sad to see that in that 2020 year. So what are the possible reasons for that drastic decline in 2018 for the next couple of seasons? Well, one thing that did happen was that there was severe rain and windstorms that occurred that affected the overwintering sites, most of the California coastline during January to March in 2017 and again in 2018. And these were very significant storms. They actually warranted a page on Wikipedia, and I think I'll show a slide in a minute. But so that had a big impact on the butterflies, caused direct mortality, no doubt, although nobody was out there measuring these things, unfortunately. But although we do have some data that they cause early dispersal, and that's a problem. Dispersing early before milkweed is up, having to fend for themselves in the great unknown, if you like, and being battered by bad weather. And they're weak at this time too. They've been overwintering, so they're at their lowest ebb. So the inability of survivors to find milkweed probably happened. And consequently, there probably was a subsequent drastic reduction in first generation of eggs and larvae, the first breeding generation that generally occurs in inland California during March and April, round about now. And the other thing that I'll talk a lot more about is the fact that more butterflies perhaps joined winter breeding populations instead of hanging out as a non-reproductive population at the overwintering sites. So that's another possibility. But going back to the storms, that's fortunate to have John Dayton in Santa Cruz, who was monitoring all overwintering sites in Santa Cruz since goodness knows when. But in this particular year, he provided data showing that there was 10,000 butterflies at this particular site, Lighthouse Field, in January, and then early February, only 2,000. So that's a drastic decline at a time that don't usually decline. And by late February, only 800 butterflies, so mostly gone. And normally, that's the time when they normally start to decline, at the end of February. So that was very different. And how many of them actually just died there? Probably not many, because John would have seen them. It seems that they were caused to disperse, probably blown away. And that particular site actually had damage. But as I said, there was historic precipitation and wind combination. It's the combination, the wind and the rain. And it was repeated in the following season. So 2 overwintering seasons where they couldn't recover from. If it had only been one, then perhaps they might have recovered. I think the second one was really the death knell. This is Lighthouse Field again, showing some of the damage. Some of the major roosting trees were blown over in the storm. And the graph there shows that 80% decline in 4 weeks. So clearly those storms had an impact and pummeling the population, and therefore the size of the first breeding generation was, the successful survivors were too small to produce more than a dribble of migrants to the Pacific Northwest during those years. Now, I gained some further data on this from a serendipitous thing that myself and my family do every Memorial Day, and have done since 2012, when I was actually searching for monarch butterflies. And in that year, we came across this site along the Trinity River where monarchs abounded. And not only that, we actually saw them migrating along the river, heading north into Oregon. And so we visited that site the same weekend every year. It's been a family tradition. And in doing that, I gained some important data, I think, on populations of monarchs, adult monarchs seen over the 2 days, and the number of eggs and larvae we count as well, and the number of milkweed plants we examine. So these numbers in late May do appear to provide an indication of the survival and productivity of the post-overwintering generation further south. So these butterflies in late May are generally the second generation. They're the progeny of the children of the overwintering females, if you like. So, you know, the overwintering females lay their eggs closer to the overwintering sites, and they develop into adults and end up in Trinity late in May, heading towards Oregon, or stopping off in Trinity to breed. So that because there's a second generation, that they give an indication of how successful the immediate post overwintering generation was. So this rough graph shows the numbers of adults and eggs that we saw during most of the years. So just look at the red line. You can see, you know, this is number of what is it? Number of adults per hour, I think. Yes, number of adults per hour during those times. So you've seen 2015 and 2016. Well, during the whole weekend, we'd see more than 100 monarchs. And then when the collapse happened in 2017 and 2018, it died straight down. And since 2018, there was just like a handful, I think we saw. And then since then, we haven't seen any monarchs. We've been there 3 years now on Memorial Day and not seen a single solitary monarch or an egg or any evidence of any monarchs at all. So, you know, it's a good indication that success is not happening further south. And I said earlier, you know, everything depends upon success in California, both overwintering success and that first generation, most importantly. Without that first generation, we're behind the 8 ball. And so, you know, in the past few years, I haven't seen any there. Although we've had a few turn up in the Pacific Northwest in those years, you know, those numbers, you know, that have been so small that they didn't register in a population in Trinity. So it's been a very useful decade of monitoring at that particular site. And I'm excited to go back in 6 weeks' time, and I'll tell you why when we get to the end of this talk, why I'm expecting better things. So then 2020 happened, and we all know 2020 happened for lots of reasons, but in the monarch world, something happened as well. I'm not talking about the tagging program tonight. Most of you know about that. And we continued it during the bad years. I managed to find a few females here and there and managed to breed. Unfortunately, the prisoners weren't able to help. I wasn't able to give them any for a couple of years now. But in this particular year, 2020, we did tag 1,300. Most of those were in Oregon, where there was a larger population. And the surprising thing was that none of these 1,300 turned up at overwintering sites. And yet, in all the previous years, 63% of recovered tags were at overwintering sites. And we still got tag recoveries in 2020 from our 1,300. We got the 7 that we would expect percentage-wise. That's what you would expect. If you tag 1,300, you'd expect to get 7 to 10 tags recovered in California. So we did get our expected recoveries, but they were all in Northern California or the Bay Area, usually in association with milkweed. Some of them looked like they were migrants, but others looked like they were just hanging around milkweed, like reproductive individuals. And so that was the first sign to me that something was up. The fact that we didn't find any of our tags that year at the very small populations at the overwintering sites, when I thought, since the populations were so small, the chances of finding our tags might have been higher. So what was happening? Well, the other interesting thing about autumn 2020 was that it was extremely warm in San Francisco Bay Area and California generally during the autumn. That was one of the years they had major fires, very serious fires. San Francisco Bay Area during September, October 2020, the mean daily maximum was 75 degrees, which, as you can see from the graph there, is way above the long-term mean. And there were some days where the temperature reached 100 degrees in the Bay Area. And the Bay Area is where the monarchs, the migrants are flying through, heading towards Santa Cruz or Pismo or whatever. So they encountered these extremely hot conditions in September and October, which was obviously not normal, a normal state of affairs for them. And the other thing that that happened in winter, that winter, was there were more sightings of monarchs within the Bay Area, both adult butterflies, but also, more interestingly, the numbers of caterpillars and chrysalises were much higher than normal. And so I looked at iNaturalist, the report in sight that people report their nature observations, and looked for monarchs, and looked at January sightings over the past 6-7 years or whatever, and compared it to what we were seeing in January 2021. And there's a huge uptick, as you can see, in the numbers of both immatures and also adults, again suggesting that there was more breeding going on in the Bay Area than had been seen before. There had been 1 or 2 caterpillars previously found in the winter, but literally 1 or 2, not dozens and more than that, as was being found in 2021. So like the autumn temperatures, the winter temperatures in San Francisco have also more often than not been higher than the long-term mean in recent years. I don't have 2020-21 data there, but it was about the same as it was the previous year, or a little bit higher, in fact. So this is above the long-term mean, and perhaps is more suitable for monarch breeding populations during this time. The temperatures are better. So while the official overwintering monarch count in 2020 at the overwintering sites was the lowest ever recorded, 1,899, the winter breeding population in the San Francisco Bay Area appeared to be the largest ever seen. Mostly anecdotally, I must admit, but that's what it appeared to be. And immediately I wondered if these two things were linked. I mean, it's pretty obvious to wonder if these two things are linked. And that is, a major decline in monarch populations, accompanied by an increase in winter breeding in overwintering areas. Then all of a sudden, a light bulb went off in my head, because where have I seen that before? I had seen that before, back 40 years, 43, 44 years now. As you heard in the introduction, I did my PhD on the monarch in Sydney, Australia, looking at the adaptation of the monarch butterfly to Australian conditions. And one of the major things that I found was that there was winter breeding occurring in Sydney that hadn't been recorded before. And I didn't immediately associate it with the decline that had occurred, which there had. And this is before I started my studies, between 64 and 78. When I started, there was a decline in the overwintering populations, similar to what's occurred in California. They had, hundreds of thousands of butterflies in 64 that went down to like 3,000 at each site when I started looking at the monarch. So it was the same thing. And there was winter breeding occurring. And the previous researchers that was looking at this had never seen winter breeding. So the same thing that happened in 2020 had happened in Sydney way back, 40, 50 years ago. But the interesting thing is that, in the time since, when I hadn't been studying the monarch there, with the populations have maintained themselves, lower but variable breeding, non-breeding populations. Some years there'll be more non-reproductive colonies, and some years more breeding colonies. As far as we can tell, there's not much data to go on, which is why I wrote this paper that's referenced at the bottom there, my sister, just a couple of years ago, reviewing what we knew about migration and overwintering and bringing all the data together that happened since I did my work, which unfortunately wasn't much. But the fact remains that a drastic decline in monarch numbers that occurred at that time did not result in extinction. So, I'm pretty sure they went below the extinction threshold, but it didn't cause the extinction or extirpation of the monarch butterfly in New South Wales, Australia, and they're still existing today, from year to year, low but variable numbers. So so this has really informed a lot of what I think about is happening with our Western population, as you can expect it would. And I was compelled to write this commentary article that's published in a journal called Animal Migration, published exactly a year ago, because there was so much talk about extinction at that time. But with this feeling that not the feeling, but the knowledge that I had of what had happened in Australia, I had the view that this was just the case of the monarchs adapting to different conditions, different climate conditions, adaptation, rather than spiraling into oblivion as some other people thought. I was accused of being or taking the Pollyanna type view in this, but I firmly believed it, and because I was informed by what I'd seen. I mean, it was a very deja vu, serendipitous experience, really. It's really weird how the beginning of my career has collided with the end of my career. So anyway, and I just getting on my hobby horse a little bit here now, because the view that I'm expounding here is not the commonly accepted view. I am out on a limb here. Most other monarch scientists don't believe what I'm saying is necessarily true, but what I'm saying goes back to a lot of what I learned when I did my PhD work and years after that, when I published all the papers that are listed there that deal with physiology and ecology of monarchs, that that they may be old papers, but they're still good. It's still good data that was published in peer-reviewed publications. And I've learned a lot from what I did then, and it does inform me as to what the monarchs are doing. We need to think about their physiology in particular, and I'll talk more about that as we go through this. So yeah, and I guess the reason I put this slide up is that I have the feeling that a lot of this work has been totally ignored by current day monarch scientists, unfortunately, but that's as it is. So like Sydney, Australia populations, I think winter populations in California may become an annual mix of non-breeding overwintering butterflies and winter breeding urban butterflies, as appear to occur in 2020-21. And it may be that the temperatures that the butterflies, the migrants experience in California as they fly through, heading to the overwintering sites, may be a key determinant of the overwintering strategy in each year. So if they encounter warm conditions, they may be more inclined to become reproductive. If it's more average normal conditions, as in the past, then maybe they'll continue on to the overwintering sites and do what they normally do. So how, so with this anecdotal evidence for winter breeding, how real was it? I really wanted to know that. I mean, I was aware that in that commentary paper, I was depending upon iNaturalist data, and there's some problems with that, of course. iNaturalist, there may have been more people looking for monarchs in that particular year because of COVID, and issues like that. So I really wanted to get some data on winter breeding in the San Francisco Bay Area if I possibly could. All this happened, literally within weeks, between December and January 2020 and 2021, to find out what was happening. Things like, how big were these winter populations, breeding populations? Was there subsequent generations? How successful were they? The survival rate? Were there sufficient nectar and host plant resources for them? And also importantly, with discussions with other scientists, it became, I came across this idea that perhaps monarchs, since they decided, I want to use that word, to live in San Francisco for the winter and reproduce, why go north in the spring? Why not just stay there year round? Which was, to me, the silly thing to say, because we're talking about physiology again, and I'll get on to that eventually. But we need to prove that a winter breeding population could rejoin the northward migratory population in the spring. So, you know, dispersal and migration, we need to know about that from winter breeding colonies. There's also some concern about parasitism, OE, which is a protozoan parasite that most of you will have heard of. There was some concern that these winter breeding populations might exacerbate OE levels amongst the general population. So important to collect data on that too. So anyway, long story short, I wasn't able to just pack up my bags and go and live in California and do this work that I wanted to do. But instead, through the miracle of social media, I was able to acquaint myself with these three ladies here who became my co-authors on this paper. So literally, this study was conducted by them during January to June last year. I wrote it up in the summer, and it was published in October that year. So, you know, 9 months pregnancy, if you like, for this paper, which I've never done before in the whole of my career. Had done the work and published in such a short time frame. But I felt it was very important to have at least some data on winter breeding. This paper is only a first shot at it, but it does provide some interesting data and answer some questions. But it's certainly not the be all and end all of studies of winter breeding. But I felt it was important to get something out. So I briefly want to acknowledge my, wonderful collaborators in this. Karen was actually one of the people that sort of alerted me to the fact that winter breeding might be happening when we had two migrants from the Pacific Northwest turn up, one in LA and one in San Francisco, as reproductives. And this is Karen's photograph that she took in her backyard in Palo Alto in the South Bay area of one of our tags from Oregon laying eggs on her backyard milkweed. So this was 2019, I think. So before the winter breeding population really took off, we had these little clues that maybe something was happening. And since she was involved in this, she got excited by it, and monarchs became her life after that, thankfully for me. And so she was able to be, an important part of this work. Annie Carl is another one of my collaborators there who has been monitoring monarchs at a community garden in Palo Alto for some time. And lastly, Maria Schaefer, who's actually a marine scientist, but she swapped nudibranchs for monarchs for a time. In fact, she still is, by doing regular population monitoring of monarchs at Googleplex. Yes, Googleplex, would you believe, was the site that we were able to use because it simply had an abundance of monarchs. The Googleplex is a campus designed to actually encourage wildlife. They planned it for wildlife habitat. And so as part of that, they grew flowering shrubs and milkweed, native and introduced tropical milkweed. And so it's a habitat, with trees, as you can see there. It's a great habitat, and the monarchs thought so too, because that's where we found the biggest concentration of monarchs. So that's where we decided to do our population study. And we found that in this particular site, there was abundant winter nectar. And most of the plants that they grew there were plants that, are available, obviously, in in the San Francisco Bay Area, and you can find in, backyards anywhere. There was abundant non-native milkweeds plus native milkweeds. The non-native milkweeds are important because they retained growth during the entire winter. There was some pruning of them going on, but Googleplex didn't prune them all at the one time. So there was always some milkweed available. But interestingly, we found that some native milkweeds, like this fascicularis narrow-leaved milkweed, actually remained green until the end of December, which is a lot longer than we thought they would. So Maria did weekly monarch counts during February to June, just by doing a 30-minute walk through Googleplex, counting the monarchs, you see. she would see. So, it varied between 0.7 to nearly 1.6 butterflies seen per minute. So that's a lot of butterfly. Every minute you're seeing butterflies flying around. And I went there a few times, and sure enough, that's what it is. They're flying around the place. And so throughout the rest of the winter, unfortunately, we didn't do it earlier simply because we didn't know, this all was born in an instant, as I've described. But, from anecdotal evidence that my collaborators did prior, particularly Maria, on the iNaturalist, we do know that numbers were comparable prior to our official studies. But we did see this decline in numbers in April, which is interesting. It is interesting because that's the time when this generation should be leaving to head north, to join the Northern California population and heading into Oregon and Pacific Northwest. So even just this disappearance of butterflies at the end of April was suggestive that there's some dispersal going on at that time, meaning that they weren't staying there. There was a decline. The same with egg. The egg population declined too, and the larval population. So we got all this data, and we also did some tagging too, which I won't talk a lot about because we probably really shouldn't have done it because in California they don't like tagging anymore. But we'd already started tagging once they suddenly decided that people shouldn't tag. We were halfway through the project, so I didn't feel inclined to stop. So we reared and tagged, Karen did in particular, during January to June to see if we could detect movement, during that time frame. So we did, unfortunately, we didn't get any definitive data or recovery of a tagged monarch up in Trinity or Oregon or anywhere else that would definitively say this population contributed to the migration. But we did get some indicative evidence like the decline in the population, as you saw on the previous slide, and also the increased propensity for dispersal amongst our tag population. In other words, tag recoveries were a longer distance when we got to later in the season, April, May and June. They moved more than they did in January and February. So that suggested they were moving. And the recoveries were invariably made from places to the north and east. So they seem to be flying in the right direction because migrants would be going north or east to colonize the rest of the Western US. And that's what they appear to be doing. We just lacked that, that butterfly that traveled a long distance, but we didn't tag that many butterflies. So I'm not surprised at that. We need to do a lot more, but unfortunately, it's against the law to do that in California at the moment. So this initial study on winter breeding in the Bay Area showed that breeding continued through the winter on non-native milkweeds. Most of the native milkweeds did die out. So the non-native milkweeds are definitely important in this situation and probably other situations in the survival of this breeding population during the winter. And in that year, that 2020-21 year, it was obviously very important since there was hardly any butterflies at the overwintering site. So tropical milkweed, for all its faults, and we'll talk about those later, performed a valuable service, as sometimes, introduced plants will sometimes do. And we also saw dispersal to the north during late April and early May. So our very quick, rapid study that we managed to complete, and I'm proud of that we were able to do it, and we have the data there published, did actually show that the population during winter does appear to be viable. And it is a real thing. It's not just anecdotal information anymore. Okay, so moving on to that, from that to last summer, so we're getting closer to the current time, summer 2021 in the Western US was characterized by larger populations of monarchs than in previous years. It wasn't substantial in Washington. I mean, we saw 12 last year. Since I've been working on this for so long, I get people reporting their monarchs to me, and I monitor all the recording sites too, and there were 12 confirmed sightings in Washington last year, compared to 1 in 2020, and that was doubtful as well. And there was also substantially greater populations in Utah, Arizona, in Nevada, and also Idaho. Actually, we should put Idaho down as having much better populations than Washington, for example. This slide is actually the only monarch that I saw personally at McNary Dam, which is just across the border into Oregon, but just fly across the river into Washington. So they did better last year. So that was promising. The population was better than last year, and I was keenly waiting all summer to see what the temperatures were going to be like in the San Francisco Bay Area in the autumn in 2021, to see if they were going to be at the high levels that they were in 2020. Well, as you can see, they were not. They're actually below the long-term mean. So they were definitely what would have been experienced in the distant past when populations were huge at overwintering sites. And more importantly, I guess there was no temperature distraction for incoming migrants in the Bay Area last autumn. So, I was at that point, I was predicting we're going to have a better overwintering population this year than the previous year, simply because this suggests that a lot of them are not going to be stopping off to breed. And sure enough, we had a rebound, an incredible rebound, a much bigger rebound than I anticipated. I mean, I thought maybe it would be up to 20,000 or 30,000 as it was in the years before the 1899. But look, it was up to 247,000. And I put Pollyanna vindication there, perhaps. So my optimism that I expressed in March, I felt really happy last autumn, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, to see this. And it was way beyond my expectations. So it's actually the highest population recorded, the overwintering sites, since 2016. It was higher then, but 2017 was less than 200,000. So it's been how many years? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years since we've had those sort of numbers at the overwintering sites, and that's why I'm excited about this coming summer in the Pacific Northwest. But first of all, how did this happen? This is a picture I took this last November. Of course, I had to go down and have a look at this wonderful spectacle. And since I've been down there so often with the tagging program, I know lots of sites now that are off the beaten track that are recorded, but not many people go to. And this is one at Cambria that really is a magical place. It's like a mythical forest, and you're on your own there, and you look up and the butterflies are flying in the sky like this. Yeah, it was incredible seeing the numbers last year at all the sites. So I'll spend some time now talking about the physiological drivers that I think are behind monarch population dynamics. And the studies that I did 40 years ago have informed a lot of this, and we need to understand the relationship between environmental cues and the physiology in monarchs to understand what they're going to do. And unfortunately, some people don't take that into account, I feel. So getting right back to basics, what determines the creation of migratory and non-breeding monarchs? I mean, you'll be surprised to know perhaps that the data on this and the studies on this are pretty sparse. We have some data, but not much. We have my data from Australia and one other publication, some research that was done about turn of the century here on US populations, but that's it. And it's not good enough. We need more. But those studies do show that the main drivers of creation of migratory and non-reproductive monarchs are decline in day length principally, and probably secondarily temperatures, maybe almost as important sometimes, and thirdly, perhaps senescing milkweed. So those are the things. And the single study that was done in America is referenced at the bottom there. And the important thing with their studies, well, they showed that decline in day length and temperature and food quality all appeared to play some role, with decline in day length apparently having the biggest role. But what they looked at primarily was these conditions, these inductive conditions affecting larval development. They didn't look at the adults at all. So they were just looking at the conditions experienced by caterpillars as they were developing, whether they were developing under declining day lengths or not. And so that was good, because it actually complements the work that I did in Australia, going back 80 years, 40 years to the 80s. I'm not as old as that. So that's me doing my PhD work. But what I found, what my principal finding was, I concentrated on the adults, the temperatures experienced by newly eclosed adults, the first 48 to 96 hours. I did look at larval stages as well, but I made the mistake of just subjecting caterpillars to a fixed short photo period, a winter photo period, thinking that that was the that was the thing I should do. In fact, I should have exposed them to declining day lengths, but I didn't do that. But an observation suggested that the adults seem to respond to conditions, and so I looked at the adults, and I did find that the temperatures did affect, the temperatures that they experienced in the first few days of life affected whether they became migrants or whether they became reproductive. And the temperature, magic temperature, seemed to be around 64 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees centigrade. So below that, migration and dormancy, and above that, reproduction and no migration. So really, the two studies combined show that these environmental factors are affecting both life stages. They're affecting larvae and adults, and possibly pupae too. We don't know who's tested that. But so it's likely that these cues, the temperature, the decline in day lengths, SASN is something that Chip Taylor talks about, which is the sun angle at solar noon. That probably plays a role too, just the angle of the sun. They operate on both immature stages and newly eclosed adults. So, they get the information from both, or maybe one of the stages. I mean, in my studies, they're only exposed in one of the stages. And the same with the American study too. Here we have day length declining significantly from late July onwards, and the first migrants to close when we start losing 2 minutes or more per day in early August. And you've seen all my graphs before, and we get migrants going to Washington. Well, here we come back to what I was talking about before, which is, we had a few of those migrants actually becoming reproductive. And so that was the first sign that something odd was happening. They were arriving in San Francisco, experiencing warm conditions perhaps, and abandoning reproductive dormancy in favor of reproduction. And that goes back to some work that I did in my PhD days as well. But at this time, I was wondering, and I'd made this slide before the 2020 situation, wondering if increasing fall winter temperatures in California could be contributing towards the decline in populations at overwintering sites just by making larger breeding populations. And the study that I did back in the 80s looked at the nature of ovarian dormancy in monarchs, and my work showed that it wasn't a true diapause, it was an oligopause. That's a name I got from the literature from another study, which meant the dormancy was more flexible. With diapause, it's not flexible at all. So with a true diapausing insect, the fact that it experiences hot conditions wouldn't necessarily make it become reproductive again. But if it's in oligopause, then that could happen. So that's what the situation is with Australian monarchs and possibly with Western North American monarchs. Nobody's done comparable work to that here, so we don't know for sure. But, you know, what we're seeing in San Francisco Bay suggests that, you know, that's what's happening. The monarchs going through the Bay Area in autumn are becoming reproductive because of the record high temperatures that happened in 2020. And that may be the prime cause for the record low overwintering population at the overwintering sites. So maybe in that year, the overall population hadn't changed substantially, hadn't gone down to 1,899. It's just that most of the population perhaps was on the broader landscape in the Bay Area, but also anywhere between LA and San Francisco in urban areas, that they could have all been there and uncountable, of course. Breeding populations are uncountable. So the missing 28,000 monarchs in 2021 may have been present, but as breeding butterflies inland. It's all, you know, impossible to know, but something that was interesting was that circumstantial evidence suggesting that the migration north and east last spring was actually better than 2020, despite the overwintering numbers being much smaller. So this was, you know, the migration following the measly number of the overwintering sites compared to the previous year when there was 30,000. And there was no, you know, this is not anecdotal, it is data collected from people that have reported it to me. But, you know, in 2020, after the overwintering population of 30,000, we had 26 reports of monarchs in Oregon and Washington during June and July, during the migration north. That's when I'm usually monitoring what's happening. And last year, after only 1899 were at the overwintering sites, we had 31 reports. So at that point, I realized something was happening because the 1899 couldn't have resulted in as many sightings as 30,000 butterflies did. It just didn't make sense. So the only, you know, conclusion from that I had was that the progeny from the winter breeding population on the broader landscape were also contributing to the migratory population. So this is, you know, other circumstantial evidence that winter breeding populations can still contribute to the migration in the spring, which, you know, I'm convinced will do, simply because of the physiology that I've just explained. You know, you're going to get that environment, those environmental cues operating on the first adult generation that's produced in inland California about this time, actually, April, May. The day lengths are increasing, temperatures are increasing, and they will get that message and they will travel north. It doesn't matter whether they've been part of a winter breeding population or they're in a population whose mothers came from an overwintering site. The same physiology applies. So the question that a lot of people have had in this past year is that could an overwintering population of 1899 produce a subsequent overwintering population of 247,000, as we've just seen? And, you know, some people, even renowned monarch people like Chip Taylor of Monarch Watch, have done some calculations, just simple calculations with the knowledge that we know about, you know, about expectancy, you know, survival, etc., of populations. And it's impossible to think that 1899 individuals, which actually means that there's probably only 450 females by March 2021, that they could produce that amount. The best, most optimistic estimate suggests, you know, something up to 20,000 could be what we might expect if favorable conditions occurred in all the generations during the summer last year. And this number 20,000 was what I was hoping for last, you know, the overwintering population. So, you know, the 247,000 is way out of the ballpark in terms of possibilities of it being achieved just from the progeny of those overwintering site individuals. So where did all the monarchs come from? Well, you've heard my theory on that, which is the winter breeding populations. I'm not saying it's only those, but I think they made up a pretty sizable majority, because California and also Arizona, I hadn't talked about, also had sizable winter breeding populations, and they would head north in the spring as well, populating Utah and Nevada perhaps. So I think that's part of it, a big part of it. Chip Taylor thinks that there may have been some unknown overwintering sites that we didn't detect, and this sort of, he's thinking that, you know, because it was so warm in September, October, that maybe some higher elevation sites on the coastal range in California may have hosted some overwintering individuals. And I guess they didn't need to be all clustering together either. They probably would, though, if they were doing that overwintering. But, you know, none were found. And you'd think with the population of California and people getting outdoors, although it was COVID times, I don't know. So it's a possibility. And the third possibility is Mexico. Monarchs arriving from overwintering populations in Mexico, which I'll mention in a minute, a bit more detail. But getting back to physiology again, just re-emphasizing this point, that there is no reason to think that California winter breeding populations in March, April 2021 did not respond to increasing day lengths, temperatures, and SASN by becoming migratory. And that's what they're doing right at this moment. The population that's in inland California that was being produced by the overwintering populations have all dispersed now. And there's some good data coming out of California already that suggesting that there are caterpillars on milkweed feeding happily now, producing this first generation of new adults, and they will respond to the current environmental conditions in California in terms of day length and temperature to migrate north. And hopefully I will see some of those in Trinity in a few weeks' time. Monarchs from Mexico. So this is an old theory suggesting that in some years, or maybe all years, there is some not loss, I guess, but some spring migrant monarchs from the Mexican overwintering colonies go more westerly rather than directly north or northeasterly, and get, you know, diverted to the west side of the Rockies. And maybe in some years this is more evident than others. It does seem to occur in most years, as determined by the sudden arrival of warm monarchs in Arizona around about now, actually, suggesting that they've come from somewhere where they've been overwintering, or maybe they've been overwintering somewhere else, but somewhere else in Mexico. And so there is that possibility, and we don't need that many to get in by that route to have an impact on our Western population. You know, there's millions here, of course, so, you know, there could be a significant trickle going that way. And if the winds are in the right direction, there could be more. So this idea and theory was first espoused by Lincoln Brower and Bob Pyle in a paper they wrote some time ago now. And I still think it's valid today, and it could well have been a part of what happened last year. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the best summer populations last year were in Utah, Arizona, Nevada as well, and Idaho. I mean, I strongly believe from our tagging work that a lot of Idaho's populations do come from Mexico and also go to Mexico, since we get quite a lot of tag recoveries heading in that direction. We can't confirm that yet, but there does seem to be a route that way. So the Mexican influence last year could have been more significant than we realize. So we call this Brower's burst or Pyle's proliferation to be equally fair, because I'm not sure which of those two guys actually came up with the idea. Both of them probably. So anyway, you can't can't stop harping on this fact that, you know, the overwintering population this year was this number, you know, counted by the Zoology Society, with the, you know, cooperation of all the citizen scientists there. This is a terrific result, and let's hope, you know, we can keep that up in future years. So I mentioned the Trinity thing, and so the last time we had an overwintering population comparable to that size that we had last year, prior to that, was 2014, and the Memorial Day following that weekend, I counted more than 100 monarchs at Trinity. So it is possible that I might see 100 monarchs at the weekend, Memorial Day weekend coming up. And if I don't see any, then there's something drastically wrong with population development between the overwintering sites and Trinity. So it does sort of give a fairly good handle on what is going on. I mean, I think we'd probably see many dozens of monarchs this year, which would be great after 3 years with seeing nothing. But it also, the numbers we see here will give a good indication as to how many we see in the Pacific Northwest this summer. So I'll go out on a limb, since I'm getting into a Nostradamus game here, but I think we'll have the best showing in the Pacific Northwest for 6 years. And I suggest that if you have flowering milkweed in your garden, you should check it in June, because that's when the migrants turn up. This is a picture I took at Crab Creek in the good old years, just a few years ago, when the first week of June would be when they turn up. Even on the west side, every June I would have reports on the west side of monarchs traveling through Seattle, Portland, and all the cities and major population centers on the west side. Not as many as on the east side, but there will be some traveling through, and they invariably stop when they find a milkweed patch, of course. So keep your eyes open come June this year. So getting near the end now, and so I've talked about how important the vulnerability of post-clustering monarchs is, and the other organisations are aware of this, and this is something everybody agrees on. I think that this is the most vulnerable period when they leave the clustering sites, and that for them to achieve the reproductive potential that they need to. And so, I wonder if there's some things we can do about that. I mean, obviously we need to make sure there's more milkweed around for them within flying distance of the overwintering sites. And so then I go back, I have to think back to the situation in Australia, because there are differences and there's similarities, but this is a monarch overwintering in Australia, which is actually similar to some of the overwintering sites that I'm aware of on the California coast, down near San Luis Obispo, actually. There's some sites that are quite similar to this in gullies. But the one thing that is very different about the Australian overwintering sites and not replicated California sites is the fact that all Australian overwintering sites have milkweed present, circled here, flowering, growing, and it doesn't interfere with the reproductive dormancy and the diapause of the butterflies roosting in the trees. They're not concerned by it at all. They do nectar from the flowers if they're flowering, but they don't terminate their dormancy and become breeding individuals all of a sudden. They retain their dormancy, and this is where we get back to physiology again. They're physiologically tuned to be dormant for a certain period of time, and that's not altered by the presence of milkweed, which unfortunately some people in this country, sometimes scientists reckon that is what could happen. There's no good scientific data to show that does happen with American populations yet. And we need more research on this fact, but I feel that, as in Australia, it's not going to be an important factor in changing the behavior of overwintering monarchs. So we don't find milkweed at overwintering sites, and there's a good reason for this, because our California overwintering sites are invariably much closer to the coast than the Australian sites. The Australian sites, interestingly, are usually a couple of miles inland or further. And milkweed, our milkweed, will not grow along the coast, but it will grow a mile inland, 2 miles. It depends on whereabouts on the coast, north or south you are, but it's not too far inland you go before milkweed will grow. So maybe we should be putting milkweed closer to the overwintering sites. I think at the moment, the recommendation is, I don't know, 20 miles away or 10 miles away, certainly a long distance away. And, you know, if we got monarchs that have been beaten to almost death by a storm, then having milkweed, you know, within flying distance of a very unfit female might be of benefit to the population. Just something to think about anyway, that based on my Australian work suggests is not a problem. In fact, this picture I usually show when I'm talking about this point, because these are overwintering Australian monarchs. They're reproductively dormant, but they're overwintering on milkweed. This is a milkweed plant they're on. They're aggregating and they're remaining dormant. They're not suddenly becoming reproductive. So, you know, presence of milkweed is not necessarily going to have a physiological effect on the butterflies. But you know, this is a reiteration of the importance of physiology. You know, the monarch behavior is based on physiology. The induction of migration and reproductive dormancy is controlled by physiology, and monarchs respond physiologically to environmental cues, primarily day length change and temperature. And although host plant presence is important, it will not, as far as we can tell, override or dictate physiology. And therefore monarchs will not terminate migration or dormancy solely in response to host plants. Okay, so I think at this point, Paulette and I thought we might pause for questions before I get on.
We do have a few questions, David. So this is really great news. To go back to the sources of the original recent decline over the last couple of decades, there was a question about neonicotinoids and why they were used so heavily in greenhouses.
For greenhouse or glasshouse crops in Europe, they're greenhouses, I think, glasshouses. So they grow in the Netherlands in particular, grow peppers and tomatoes, and they're producing crops year round, and they have many glasshouse pests, whiteflies and mites and things. So they're spraying continually through the whole year, and so yeah, that's the reason why.
And do you have any insight into how the ban is affecting agriculture in Europe?
No, it's too early to tell yet. I would hope there are studies being conducted at this very minute. But it's only been 2 growing seasons since, so they wouldn't have been published yet anyway. And because we're talking about sublethal effects, you know, it could be more than that, 5 years before you know, some of those sublethal impacts are, you know, shown not to be there anymore, and populations start to increase. So I'm watching that literature, and because that, you know, once we, you know, if assuming we do get those studies, then that will be, you know, something that we can point out to the US government, and you know, that this is something we need to do, because it will demonstrate, you know, the impact and then the removal of these chemicals on pollinator health.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions about migration. One, you talked about the impact of temperature on migratory behavior, but 2 questions. One is whether wildfires might affect migration, and secondly, a question about migration paths, whether the ones that you see on the Trinity River, do they usually follow watercourses, and do they take the watercourses up to north? Can you comment on those?
Yeah, well, the first question about the fires, we don't think so. We did a little bit of work on that. Well, it was serendipitous, really. We just used our tagging research, where some had been tagged under very smoky conditions and surrounded by fire. compared to individuals that were in the same location but at a different time when the fire wasn't there. And we found that the fire and the smoke didn't affect the survival and the viability or the migration ability of the monarchs. They negotiated their way through the fire and the smoke, maybe around it rather than through it, I guess. So we don't have, there's no data really apart from that to show that the impact of fires, but I suspect that they will fly around fires. The impact of fires on breeding populations is more serious, of course, if breeding populations are affected in the fire area. But as regards the migratory ability of the monarch, I don't think it's a huge issue at this point on the landscape anyway. And the other question was, sorry.
About water courses.
Oh, the water courses, yeah. Well, yes, well, interestingly, you know, we don't have much data on that either. We just have observations. We've seen them flying along water courses, but also roads and lines. Insects generally do like to travel along lines, corridors, if you like. So, you know, we definitely saw them flying up the Trinity River, and I looked on the map at the Trinity River, and it makes a right turn. It turns to the east, and we actually, during that time, we actually tagged them on flying up the river, and we had a recovery. We only tagged 28, I think, but we had a recovery, and its recovery was in Idaho. So it perhaps did fly up the Trinity River, turned right, and flew on to Idaho. But, you know, we don't know for sure. But it's also, you know, if the river or the line that is following doesn't correspond to the direction it's supposed to be taken, you know, as, you know, by navigation through the celestial cues, you know, then they know they've got to go north or east or south or whatever, then, you know, they will veer off of a river course if it's not going in the right direction.
Another question about tagging and California discouraging tagging. This may link in with your next topic, but I just wanted to throw that out. It was a topic, question from David Berger.
So what's the question?
Why is California discouraging tagging?
Why? Well, they're just, this came about because of the very low population, the 1899, and the fear that it was going to become extinct, the butterfly is going to disappear. That fear percolated through to government agencies, and with the precautionary principle of, you know, doing no harm at all, even though, you know, we don't know that handling monarchs, or I know that it doesn't harm them if you do it correctly, but, you know, not knowing what people might do, they just decided to have a blanket ban on rearing and touching. You can't even put a cage on them in your garden, I don't think, either. So completely hands off. I'm hopeful that it's a temporary thing, and if populations do rebound, they will reconsider that. But at the moment, it is still a ban, and yeah, I hope it changes.
Okay, let's see. Question about what can we as individuals do to help monarchs, and you may be addressing that in your next section.
Yeah, I'll address that as we go forward.
Okay, Carl Barrington had a question about whether there's an evolution of a non-migratory population of monarchs. You know, you talked about the physiological reasons for choosing migration versus overwintering. Do you see any possibility of an evolutionary behavior?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the next step. That probably will happen in time. They will evolve and change and adapt to the conditions that are occurring. You know, ultimately, if you look very far in the future, maybe the migration will disappear. But, you know, not in the near term. That is going to, you know, that will take a much longer period of time, I think, since the pressures are not that severe at the moment, and the butterfly is a very adaptable creature. I think it's showing itself to be, so it's adapting rather than evolving into something else at this point. But yeah, the future.
Okay, let's proceed then.
Okay, the future, yes. Controversies first, though. And the first controversy is one I touched on briefly, the non-native milkweed question, and whether they're bad for monarchs. The trouble is, you get stories come out and they get mistaken and misinterpreted. So, some people think that non-native milkweeds are bad for monarchs. The monarchs do love non-native milkweeds, unfortunately or fortunately. And when I'm talking about non-natives, I'm talking about tropical, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's the one you most often see in big box stores or at any nursery in Seattle, I think, and certainly in California. But in California, there's also quite a lot now of balloon milkweed and swan milkweed for sale. And these are African milkweeds, also quite attractive. I mean, that's the thing about these non-native milkweeds. They are very ornamental and attractive to people, but also monarchs love them too. So the perceived issues are that they exacerbate parasite OE problems, and this is the protozoan parasite that can affect monarchs, and they might also discourage migration, which I've spoken about already, and the fact that I disagree that they do that, but that's something that has been raised as a possibility. It's not based on scientific evidence, and so I think we can discount that. So really, it comes down to exacerbation of OE. And the problem with these milkweeds is they don't die back in the fall unless cold weather occurs. So in Seattle, they might die back. But in California, they don't. They can remain green throughout the winter. As we saw at Googleplex, the study there, they remain green throughout the winter. And so therefore, OE spores can accumulate and remain viable, which means that, under native milkweed situations, there's a break in the OE cycle whereby, they have to start again in the spring. So, but with non-native milkweed, then the cycle can continue during the winter, and in theory, exacerbate the OE problem for monarchs. So that's the gist of the problem, just creating larger OE problems for the monarch. But I have a slightly different take on OE as a problem in monarchs as well, because you have to get back to fundamentals and realize that it's a natural parasite of monarchs, and they've co-evolved together over millennia. And so being a parasite, it doesn't want to kill its host. The parasite's the definition of a parasite. It's not a parasitoid, which does kill its host. A parasite does not kill its host, or doesn't want to. I mean, it might end up harming it, but not necessarily killing it. But if there's too many of them, then they can't kill. But the point is that they've created a balance over millennia, to and froing between these two organisms. The monarch defending itself in some ways. Some research has shown they can actually defend themselves by feeding on more toxic milkweed, to sort of get medicine from the milkweed. So that there's a battle going on between OE and monarchs. But under unnatural conditions, there's no doubt that it can be a problem. So if you rear monarchs and you don't do it in a healthy way, particularly continuous rearing, like some companies continually rear monarchs throughout the year without a break, that can be very bad in terms of OE, unless you're scrupulous about it. Otherwise, and so there's a lack of studies on the impact on natural populations. I feel there's a lot of research being done on how bad OE is under laboratory situations, but very little natural work. And there's a great lack of research on OE in the West too, which is, there's been a number of studies recently that have shown surprising differences between the West and the Eastern population. Even though they're genetically the same, there's some studies that have shown some odd differences, maybe environmentally induced rather than genetically. And so OE might be another one of those things. So really, it's many shades of grey, not a black or white thing. And I don't think OE is necessarily the most severe. It has the most severe impact on monarchs as some other people think. So we need to take a more holistic view. There might be some impact under some conditions, some circumstances, but really the overall population, probably not. And they've found a way to exist together, and monarchs have found ways to escape from their parasite too. Migration is one of those escape mechanisms. They can, leave their host, leave their parasite behind. So when we get populations in Washington, if we look at them for OE, natural populations, we very rarely find it. And this is some data that I obtained from tagging, where I was quite naughty and actually tagged OE infected monarchs, because if I believe the conventional wisdom from research done in the East, I would not have expected OE infected monarchs to actually be able to migrate, because that's one of the issues that they cause, the inability to migrate very far. But of course, in the East, they've got a much further distance to migrate, 2,000 kilometers or 2,000 miles at least, whereas here, 1,000 kilometers is about the maximum. So anyway, with all the monarchs that reared and tagged, I had a subset in this one particular year of OE infected and OE small, or just two individuals that were none infected, all had to be released about the same time and the same place. And you could see that we had recoveries from more infected individuals. I mean, importantly, it shows that these infected individuals, and these were quite heavily infected OE individuals, parasite affected, they were found at overwintering sites, and they had traveled a long way, more than 1,000 kilometers, and lived a life that was comparable to non-infected individuals. So from this very small data sample, it showed that OE infected monarchs in Washington were not at a disadvantage in terms of migrating and living out their lives, as I thought they might be. I mean, I didn't think I'd see the OE infected individuals again. So this is only a very small data set, and it's just part contained within that paper there. It's not a focus on its own, but it's suggestive that, OE is not the big bugbear that some people maintain that it is. Okay, so the interfering with migration and reproductive dormancy, I think I've covered that already, so I won't dwell upon that anymore. So, the upshot from this is that conservation organizations recommend no planting of non-native milkweeds, and they recommend natives and not to use non-natives. And if you have them, to cut them back in October to break that OE cycle. So this is going on the accepted science that we should try and minimize OE, which I agree with. I mean, we should try and minimize OE, but to what extent should we do that? Or this slide here shows tropical milkweed cut back in October. This was in 2020 when they were reproducing in California, and that was found by one of my co-authors on the paper, and they found it was covered in caterpillars and eggs, and they went through this whole mass rescuing all the monarchs that had been abandoned by the chopping down of the milkweed. So there is perhaps a limit to doing this pruning, and to in a situation as occurred in 2020-21 winter, the non-native milkweeds may be one reason why the monarchs did hang on in the West. I mean, they could be one of the reasons why we have such a great overwintering population this last winter, and why we potentially are going to see this year in the Pacific Northwest more monarchs than we've seen for 5 years. I could make the case that it was because we had tropical milkweed supporting winter breeding in California is why we're seeing monarchs in Yakima this summer. So, what is worse for monarchs? Removing the host plants entirely so they got nothing to feed on, or allowing a natural parasite to coexist and co-evolve and to, to continue the battle with the monarch. So, in fairness, this situation is all new and rapidly evolving, but, I'd like to think that we as scientists should evolve and rapidly change as well, to take account of these new situations that are cropping up. And, finally on OE, we've got to realize that they have coexisted for a long time. And we do have monarch populations coexisting on non-native milkweeds in Florida, Australia, Hawaii, and other subtropical areas where breeding is continuous. And, as I say, there's not many studies on OE in natural populations. I'm not aware of any long-term OE study on these populations. I mean, there's bound to be fluctuations caused by OE, but there'll be rebounds as well. And I think, such a study conducted over 5 years or something would tell us an awful lot about how monarchs can cope with OE. But the point is, they do coexist in many places. And if we believe that monarchs originated in subtropical areas, which most experts do agree, then their host plant originally probably was tropical milkweed or something very similar. So the history of their coevolution may be a lot longer than we realize. And if we do remove it, we get sad situations like this, which was taken during last winter by one of my co-authors, where milkweed had been cut down correctly at the right time, but that doesn't deter the female monarch that's flying around and responding to the volatile cues from the milkweed. It's still giving off the signals, it's milkweed, and she'll lay her eggs there because there's no other plants around. She has no choice, and of course these eggs are doomed. So we need to rethink some of these things in California. Okay, so the next controversy was only 2 controversies anyway. So this is the last controversy. Is it bad to rear monarchs in captivity? This is something I've been guilty of for a long time. We've done some monarch rearing with Wobber, of course, and I still do with Kaoshi Canyon Conservancy, and also with the inmates at the prison. But since that time, we've had some scientific papers saying that it could be bad for rearing, it could be bad for monarchs by rearing them in captivity. But my look at these papers suggests that most of these papers have flaws. There's usually some problem with methodology, inappropriate or non-natural methodology. And the assertion is, and I won't go into the details and all that, but the assertion is that captive rearing may produce adults less able to migrate. That's the big deal. Some studies have shown that. And to assess migration, they've used machines in the laboratory to show whether the butterfly is migrating successfully or not. It's actually, a circular machine. The butterfly's got to fly in the lab and keep flying, and that's sustained flight means it's migrated. But our tagging program in the Pacific Northwest over all the years, and I've talked to you about before in previous talks, has shown that our reared monarchs appear to be better able to migrate, about 10 times better than the wild monarchs, because we did tag wild monarchs, but the recovery rate from them was far less than the reared. And this contradicts research done in the East, where reared monarchs' recovery rate is less than the wild monarchs tagged. So again, there may be some difference between West and East monarchs. Gail Morris, who's working on Southwest monarchs, is going to publish some work soon, hopefully, showing a similar result from monarchs in Arizona, where reared monarchs' recovery rate was also better or just as good. I don't know which, but there was certainly no difference anyway between reared and wild monarchs. So a major flaw of the captive rearing study is that they didn't look at the ability of newly eclosed monarchs to determine their migratory or reproductive future. So they based determination of reproductive status and migration status on conditions given to the caterpillars, which is fine, but the adult's going to respond as well. And so really, you need to look at that too. So yeah, as I say, all the studies except one have looked at larvae or pupae as the inductive stage, and all except one have used flight mills. That's the equipment that they use to measure migration competency. Some didn't use decline in day lengths. They made the mistake that I did back in 1980, whatever, where I just used a static day length when you've got to be using a decline in day length. And all except one concluded that captive rearing is or may be detrimental to migration competency. Fortunately, there is one study that confirms my point of view and the earlier work that I did, and also the tagging work they've done in Pacific Northwest. And this one looked at the environmental influences on adults as well as immatures. And this study looked at monarchs that were actually released outdoors and had electronic tagging, so they could monitor them using radar. And these had been, captive reared and reared under conditions. I can't remember all the conditions now, but they used conditions that you wouldn't expect to induct dormancy and migration, but they still got migration. And this is because, I believe that the adult butterflies responded to the conditions that they were released in. They were released in the autumn, and they showed migratory direction southward, southwest, or whichever direction they're supposed to go. So this one study actually supports a lot of what I've spoken about over the last hour and a half. So I was very pleased to see that study published. But really, we need far more research, both on captive rearing and OE on Western monarchs in particular, because I'm suspicious that there may actually be important differences between the East and the West. And finally, conservation. This, we are doing a great job in conservation already. Xerces Society, with the information they provide and the programs that they're working on, and other groups as well throughout the West, in California, in Oregon, we're all working to restore monarch habitat in the West. Things like golf courses and your home garden, vineyards. I think I'll talk about that in a minute. Advocate for milkweed in agriculture, which I do in my day job. I wrote that paper there a few years ago, and this is a vineyard in Oregon that's actually growing milkweed around the edges and actually in the rows as well, both for monarchs, but it also will be enhancing their pest control in vineyards, because milkweed isn't just for monarchs, it's for other pollinators and also predators and parasites of grape pests. So there's good reason to advocate for milkweed in agriculture, not just viticulture either, agriculture generally. And this will be, thing that's ongoing in the future. We have to start off small, and as pesticide inputs decline in agriculture, things like that will become more important. Don't use pesticides if you can avoid it, particularly in urban situations, and particularly neonicotinoids. If you can, look up the chemicals and try and find the 1% of insecticides that do not contain neonicotinoids if you have to spray in your garden. It is just the insecticides, of course, so herbicides are better, and fungicides, but insecticides you need to check that they don't contain neonicotinoids. Education, involvement, and this sort of thing, the whole California banning of rearing monarchs or touching monarchs just goes against this entirely. One of the reasons I hope it's a very short-lived thing, because it's just interfering with children being at one with nature, or even adults, even prisoners. It's like we have to involve and educate young people, and there's nothing better than having hands-on work and activities with monarchs. And so, children, it's critical. They're critical to continued conservation. They're the future, obviously. So this is my last slide, I think. And really, the message is to take a holistic view of what is going to happen or what is happening. I believe monarchs will persist in the West. Getting back to the title of this talk, and going forward, I think we will see breeding and non-breeding populations occurring every winter in California to a greater or lesser extent, depending largely on what happens during autumn, and what the climate does generally, with climate warming. Ultimately, as we talked about, they could evolve to do something different entirely. Maybe overwintering sites might shift further north. That's another possibility. Population size of traditional overwinterers will go hand in hand with that. They may vary considerably year to year, dictated by the autumn temperatures. But I believe the overall Western population will grow long term, as all the good stuff that people are doing takes effect. I mean, all these things take a long time to actually yield results. And as long as people remain engaged, and we still allow the children to touch monarchs, and it's going to undoubtedly have an impact in the future. So call me Pollyanna if you want, but I think it's an optimistic future for monarchs in the West, and probably in the East as well. I mean, a lot of what I said can be applied to the Eastern population as well. So reports of the death of the monarch are definitely exaggerated, and I think Annabella looks quite surprised there too. So I'd just like to thank everybody that's helped in this work. Too many to name really, but some of them are named here: Bob, Chip, John, Linda, Joe, my family, my co-authors on the paper, of course, and the tagging program people, the penitentiary people, Wobber, you've been a very big part of this as well. Perhaps this year we can have a tagging day at Crab Creek again, who knows? Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and if there's any more questions, happy to take them.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I just wanted to add one thing, especially in response to Sal's question about what can we do to help. I just wanted to add that one thing that each of us can do, if we have the capability to do so, is to grow our own food organically or purchase organic food, because that really is something that we, we can vote with our personal choices. So this is a time where it's all open. So Patty Ferris, I wondered if you would be willing to unmute and ask your question, and also you too, Kevin.
David, I was just wondering if you think that the release of various biological pest controls in organic farming are having any effect, like techinid flies are having an effect on monarch populations, especially in California?
Yes, that is possible, but we have a lot of native tachinids too. There's a whole complex of tachinid flies, and so I don't think it's all the introduced species by any means. There's a complex there. It could be making it worse, yes, for sure. But tachinids are generally, they don't occur everywhere at the one time, and they tend to occur in warmer climates down south rather than up here. So they're not a general problem throughout the landscape. So again, it could be another one of these minor factors that are combining as an issue. But I put it down in the minor category. More importantly, I'd put the introduced wasp, Polistes dominula, the European paper wasp, that definitely is having a major impact on the populations in the South Bay area of California right now. We got some horrible pictures of wasps coming to closing pupae, grabbing the butterfly out of the pupae before it's even, stretched its wings out. So they are real carnivores, and they're doing much more damage than any tachinid, I think.
And Kevin, did you want to ask your question about advantages to non-native milkweeds?
Sure. I usually favor native plants when I put things into my horticulture and landscaping, just because I like native plants for a variety of other reasons. And sometimes I recommend them on just some generic reasons and local adaptation and that sort of thing. And I'm curious if you feel like there are any advantages to planting non-native milkweed, or just if as a general rule, it is adequate to recommend planting native milkweeds just as a generic response to that sort of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, I think as a generic response, it probably is the good thing to say. But as I was, touching on late in the talk there, this situation in California has made me rethink that a little bit, because in that situation, the non-native milkweed quite possibly is playing a very important role in the winter biology of the monarchs there. And without it there, I think the native milkweeds are catching up, mind you, as I did point out too, that they're persisting much longer than they did in the past. So if climate is warming, that will continue. And, in a few years' time, we might see native milkweeds doing as well during the winter as non-natives. And maybe so we don't have to worry about non-natives then. But right at this point in time, I'd advocate, unfortunately, that's not the right word, but, non-native plants are playing a role in that particular situation that could be very important. So I hesitate to say the generic thing now because of that. But as a general principle, and if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said, yes, stick to the natives.
Okay.
All right. I'll go. Hey, yo, Polly, and I keep a complete bibliography of yours so I can slap people with it.
Good.
Your stuff is data driven. Everything else is emotionally driven. You just go, brother.
Thank you. Yeah, so you got all my old papers, have you, John?
Huh? Oh, yeah. Well, you
You
gave
want-
me half of them.
Huh?
You gave me half of them.
Did I? Oh, good. Well, you must have asked for them. I didn't impose them on you.
I'll never tell.
Cheryl, did you want to comment on plants treated and then put out? Cheryl Boline. So Cheryl, I'm not sure if she's still with us. Cheryl pointed out that sometimes plants that are raised in greenhouses, for nursery use, are treated with neonicotinoids. And so then if we go to the nursery and buy them and put them out, we think we're doing a good thing by attracting the pollinators. But if they have been treated, then maybe it's not the best choice.
That's right, and there's a lot of concern about that, and you're within your rights to ask them, have they been treated? And a lot of people are, and some big box stores are actually now labeling them as being not treated by neonicotinoids. So they're beginning to get the message, and it's not uncommon now for people to actually ask to make sure that they haven't been treated for. And it's not just milkweed either. I guess people grow plants for pollinators generally, so it's probably beyond milkweed now. So if you go to the right source, you will get neonicotinoid free plants.
Well, maybe that's another avenue for activism too, is to especially at nurseries that are smaller and maybe even family run, asking and trying to agitate for less use of neonicotinoids.
Yeah. There are alternatives that they can use, so there's no excuse. They can do it.
Okay, other questions? David's here, he's ready to answer, so fire away.
Hey, David, Jim Reed here.
Hi, Jim.
I'm curious, genetically, it seems to me like, having watched tropical monarchs in the mountains down in Peru before, they certainly aren't migratory and they're residential. Doesn't it seem genetically that there's maybe 10%, 20% of our Northwest or Western monarchs who would be genetically predisposed to not migrate? Or do you think it's all triggered physiologically?
Yeah, you're probably right. There's probably not 10%. There's probably the odd one or two that just don't know how to migrate. Interestingly, someone did some research just a few years ago looking at non-migratory populations in Australia. So in Queensland, Australia, there's a population up there that never migrates because it's too warm. And they did some work in the lab and showed that they retain the ability to migrate. So, you know, your tropical migration and wherever you're talking about, if you'd taken some of those and put them in the cold or the decline in day length, you would have got migrants from that. So they do preserve the genetic capability to migrate, even if they've been in the tropics for eons, apparently. Well, no, we don't know how long. But so it probably works the other way too. Yeah, interesting.
Oh, thank you.
So a few people have turned on their cameras. Do you have questions? Please speak up if you do. Yeah, you may have to unmute yourself. Okay, well, this has been really, really wonderful. It's great to hear some good news after so many years of just awful news. So we're really looking forward to hearing what happens at your Trinity River weekend, and hopefully, fingers crossed, it will be good news.
Yep, I'll be sure to let you know about all that. And yeah, I hope I'm right. Now that I've made the prediction, but I'm fairly confident I will be. So yeah, and once I see what's happening at Trinity, I'll be able to put it on a firmer footing as to, you know, whether we will see, you know, how many we'll see in Washington this year. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll be tagging with you this summer.
Yeah, we could do.
Yeah, we hope.
Yeah, why not?
Okay, well, thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your time and all the.
Thank you all for
work that
listening
you're
and
doing.
bearing with me for 2 hours. Wow. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you next month when Jonathan Pelham will give our presentation for May. Okay,
Thank you.
all righty. Bye-bye.
Thank you.